This is a work of complete fiction created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or actual events is coincidental. She didn't even look at him when she did it. Clara Whitmore stood in the marble lobby of the Harborview Tower, dressed in a cream blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and she handed the security guard a single folded piece of paper. Then she turned to her husband of 11 years, the man she had shared a bed with, shared meals with, shared everything with, and said, in a voice so flat it barely qualified as human, "Have someone bring his things down. Trash bags are fine." Ethan Calloway stood there holding a paper coffee cup he'd picked up from the lobby cart, and for a moment he actually thought he had misunderstood her. He hadn't. If you've never seen a story like this one before, stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will shake you to your core. This is the kind of tale that reminds you how thin the line is between power and exposure. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet, and drop a comment below telling me the city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Hit that like button, and let's begin. The coffee cup hit the marble floor at 8:47 in the morning, not because Ethan dropped it in shock, though the shock was real enough. He set it down on the edge of the concierge desk with the careful, deliberate motion of a man who is trying very hard not to do something he'll regret. The cup tipped on its own. The lid popped. A thin brown river spread across the polished floor, and nobody moved to clean it up because everyone in that lobby had gone completely still. There were maybe 12 people watching. The 2 security guards. The concierge woman whose name was Patricia and who had always waved to Ethan when he came in. A couple waiting for the elevator. A delivery guy who had stopped mid-signature. All of them frozen, the way people go still at a car accident, not wanting to stare but unable to look away. Clara didn't look at the coffee or the floor or any of them. She was looking at her phone. "Clara." Ethan's voice came out steadier than he felt, which surprised him. "What is this?" "I sent you an email last Thursday." She scrolled through something. "And again on Monday. You didn't respond." "I was in Mill Haven." "You knew I was in Mill Haven." "I knew you said you were in Mill Haven." She glanced up then, and the look on her face was the worst part of it. Not anger, not guilt, not even satisfaction, just efficiency. The expression of someone ticking an item off a list. "Your keycards have been deactivated. Your parking access has been removed. The joint accounts, Clara, have been restructured. Your personal spending account had a balance of $4,000 and change. I've transferred that to a new account in your name. You'll receive the details by email." She put the phone in her blazer pocket. "Your attorney can reach Dominic Farron at Whitmore & Associates. Everything goes through him from this point forward." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. He had known this marriage was in trouble. You don't reach 11 years without learning to read the weather, and the weather had been bad for a long time. But there is a difference between knowing a storm is coming and standing in the middle of it with no coat. "My things are upstairs," he said. "Someone will bring them down." She paused. "I said trash bags are fine, but Lorena will use boxes. She likes you." A small, almost involuntary flicker crossed her face when she said that. It was gone in half a second. "You can wait outside." "I'm not waiting outside." "Ethan, I'm not waiting outside like I'm a package being returned." He kept his voice quiet because he knew, in a distant and rational part of his brain, that losing his temper here would cost him later. "Where exactly am I supposed to go? It's 40 degrees out there." "That's not really my concern anymore." Patricia, the concierge, made a small sound. It wasn't quite a word. More like the involuntary noise you make when you watch someone step on a nail. "There's a facility on Clement Street," Clara said. "The Harborview Community Shelter. I'll have my driver take you." She said it the way you'd offer directions to a stranger. Helpful, brisk, no particular feeling behind it. "It's a legitimate place. We've donated to them." "You want to send me to a shelter?" "I want to send you somewhere that isn't here." For the first time, something genuine moved across her face. Not cruelty exactly, but a kind of exhausted finality that was somehow worse. "We're done, Ethan. This has been done for a long time. I'm just the one saying it out loud." He didn't answer. There wasn't anything to say to that, not in a lobby with 12 strangers watching and a puddle of coffee spreading toward his shoes. The boxes came down 40 minutes later. 2 of them, which turned out to be the right number. 11 years of living in someone else's space doesn't leave you with much that's actually yours. A duffel bag of clothes, his laptop, a box of engineering books and a few personal things, a framed photograph of himself and a woman who had been dead for 6 years, which Lorena had wrapped in a dish towel as if it were something fragile and precious, which it was. Clara's driver, a quiet man named Soren, who had always been decent to Ethan, loaded the boxes into the back of the car without a word. Ethan got in. The car pulled out of the Harborview Tower's underground garage and into a gray November morning, and Ethan watched his reflection in the tinted window and tried to figure out what he actually felt. Angry, yes. Embarrassed, definitely. Scared, if he was being honest, which he was trying to be. But underneath all of it, something else. Something that felt less like an emotion and more like a door opening. The Harborview Community Shelter sat on the eastern end of Clement Street, wedged between a Vietnamese grocery and a closed-down laundromat with paper still in the windows. It was a 4-story building that had been built sometime in the 1960s. Ethan could tell from the bones of it, the particular way the load-bearing walls had been positioned, the type of concrete block used in the lower facade. The building had been added to and subtracted from over the decades, patched in places where it didn't quite line up with itself anymore. It was ugly in the way that functional things often are. It was also, clearly, full of people. Soren pulled up to the curb and got out to help with the boxes. He didn't say anything until he set the second box down on the sidewalk, and then he said quietly and without looking directly at Ethan, "I'm sorry about this. It's not your fault." "No." He paused, "but still." Ethan picked up his duffel bag and looked at the building. A hand-lettered sign taped inside the front window said, "Hot meals 6 to 8 p.m. Wednesday is bingo night. Ask for Ray." He went inside. The woman at the front desk had a name tag that said Marlene and the particular brand of watchful patience that comes from working a place like this for years. Not unkind, not especially warm, just practical in the way that people become when they've seen everything. "First time?" she said. "Yes." "You got ID?" He handed it over. She looked at it, typed something, handed it back. "We got a bed open on the 3rd floor, shared room, 8 people. Curfew is 10, lights out at 11. You can store your things in the lockbox room." She pulled a form from a drawer. "Any medical needs, dietary restrictions, anything I should know about?" "No." He hesitated. "How long do you usually... what's the typical?" "There's no typical." She slid the form across the desk. "Sign at the bottom, the lines with the X." He signed. She took the form back and looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone cataloging information. "Calloway," she said. "Yes." "You want to put down an emergency contact?" He thought about that longer than he should have. The honest answer was that the person he would have listed a year ago was currently in a cream blazer somewhere across town, and before that it had been his mother, and before that, well. He wrote down the name of his college roommate, a man he hadn't spoken to in 3 years, which felt pathetic but was the best he could do. Marlene didn't comment. She took the form, stamped something, and handed him a key attached to a plastic red tag. 3rd floor, room 3C. Dinner at 6. If you need anything, Ray's usually around. "Who's Ray?" "You'll know him when you see him. He's the one who looks like he's been here since the building was built." A pause, and then, surprisingly, a small, dry, almost smile, which, in some ways, he has. Room 3C had 8 beds, as promised, and 6 of them were occupied by various degrees of personal territory. Ethan found the empty one near the window and sat on it. The mattress was firmer than it looked. Someone had left a crossword puzzle book on the nightstand with most of the puzzles filled in pencil, in handwriting that was careful and small and slightly shaky. He put his duffel bag under the bed, set the box of books on the floor, and looked at the framed photograph for a moment before leaning it against the wall where he could see it from where he sat. His mother, Catherine Mercer Calloway, in a yellow rain jacket, standing in front of what looked like a construction site. She was laughing at something off camera. She had been 44 when that photograph was taken. She had been 51 when she died. Ethan sat there for a while and let himself feel the particular grief of a man who has just lost the version of his life he thought he understood. Then he got up, because sitting felt like a luxury he hadn't earned, and went to explore the building. The exploration was partly habit and partly something he couldn't name. Ethan had been an engineer before he became Clara's husband, or rather, he had been an engineer the entire time, but somehow that fact had gotten quietly buried under 11 years of foundation dinners and donor meetings, and being introduced at parties as Clara's husband, Ethan. He's very good with technical things. He'd consulted on projects here and there, under the foundation's umbrella, and the work had kept him functional. But he hadn't been the one directing anything in a long time. The building reasserted something in him the moment he started walking it. He went floor by floor, not snooping, just looking. The way you look at a building when you know what buildings are. The stairwells were in decent shape, but the third-floor landing had a crack in the wall that ran at an angle, suggesting settling in the northeast corner. The second floor had 2 rooms that smelled of old moisture, which meant there was a drainage issue somewhere above them. The basement, which he found by following a man named Gerald who was going down there to check on the boiler, was a different world entirely. The basement was 2 levels. The upper level was utility space, boiler, electrical panels, storage, the laundry machines. The lower level was older, much older, and it took Ethan a moment to understand what he was looking at. "What is this?" he asked Gerald. Gerald was a compact, silver-haired man in his 60s who had been living at the shelter for 4 months after losing a lease dispute. He knew the building well because he'd informally adopted the role of fixing things when they broke, which was often. "Old flood chamber," Gerald said, holding up his flashlight. "City built it back in the 50s or 60s, part of the waterfront drainage system. This whole block used to be tidal land. They hardened it and built over it, but they kept the chambers underneath. When the shelter took over the building, the city kept a maintenance agreement." Ethan looked around. The chamber was roughly 30 feet by 40, with concrete walls that were clearly older than the building above. There was a central column of machinery, pipes, valves, a large mechanical gate assembly that he recognized immediately as a floodgate control system. And next to the gate assembly, mounted on the wall in a metal housing with a cracked glass face, was a mechanical counter. He leaned closer. The counter had 6 digits. The number displayed was not 0. It was not even close to 0. "Gerald," Ethan said carefully, "what does this counter track?" Gerald squinted at it. "Don't know exactly. Something to do with the gate cycles, I think. Manual overrides, maybe? I never messed with it." Manual overrides. Ethan looked at the gate assembly. The floodgate was supposed to be operated digitally. He knew that because he had been part of the team that had updated this section of the drainage network 4 years ago, one of the consulting jobs he'd done under the foundation's name. The digital system had been installed specifically to eliminate the need for manual operation. The manual system was supposed to exist only as a backup, sealed and logged. The mechanical counter was not sealed, and if it was counting manual overrides, then someone had been manually overriding this system, repeatedly, without it appearing in any digital log. He stood there in the basement of a shelter he'd arrived at 3 hours ago, and the door that had started to open in the lobby of the Harborview Tower swung a little wider. He ate dinner at 6, at a long table in the ground floor dining room, next to a woman named Felicity, who was 73 and had been living at the shelter for 2 years after her landlord converted her building to short-term rentals, and a man named Dev, who was 40 and had lost his job at a shipping company and was waiting on a housing voucher that kept getting delayed. The food was hot and plain, and someone had made too much rice, which meant there was plenty of it. Ethan ate without thinking much about what he was eating. "You're new," Felicity said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. First few days are the worst." She said it matter-of-factly, the way you say the weather's going to be bad tomorrow. After that, you start to figure out the rhythms. Breakfast is better than dinner, except on Thursdays. Thursdays, someone donates from the Italian place on Harbor, and dinner is excellent. "Good to know. What's your situation, if you don't mind?" "Divorce," Ethan said. It was the first time he'd said the word out loud in connection with himself, and it landed strange. Felicity nodded slowly. "Mine was a lease, but same general shape. Something you thought was permanent turned out not to be." She pushed rice around her plate. "You have people?" "Not nearby." "Work?" "I'm an engineer, or I was. It's complicated." She seemed to accept this without needing more. "Ray's good to talk to if you want someone to talk to. He's been here 22 years running the place. He knows everybody and everything." She paused. He also knows this building is scheduled for demolition. Ethan put his fork down. When? 12 days. She said it without any particular drama, which somehow made it worse. The city approved the sale of the parcel 6 months ago. We've been fighting it, but there's a vote in 2 weeks, and the legal people say we don't have standing to stop it. She looked at her plate. 64 residents. Some of us have nowhere else to go. Ethan looked around the dining room, at Felicity and Dev and Gerald, and a table of younger men near the window, and 2 women helping an elderly man with his tray, and a teenager doing homework in the corner, and felt something shift in his chest. Not a decision exactly, more like a recognition. "Tell me about the vote," he said. "What?" He met Ray at 8 o'clock, in the man's office on the ground floor, which was a small room so full of filing cabinets and stacked binders that there was barely room for the desk. Ray himself was exactly what Marlene had implied, a large, deliberate man in his late 60s with a thick gray beard and the particular stillness of someone who has learned that most crises pass if you don't add to them. He looked at Ethan for a long moment before saying anything. "Marlene said you were asking about the building," Ray said. "I was looking at it. Habit." Ethan sat in the chair across from the desk. "I'm an engineer. Am. "What kind?" "Structural. Civil, mostly. I've done flood infrastructure work." Something changed in Ray's face. Not surprise. More like the expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular bus for a very long time and just heard something that might be a bus in the distance. "The basement," Ethan said. "The flood chamber. Tell me what you know about it." Ray told him. The maintenance agreement with the city had lapsed 2 years ago, not because the shelter had dropped it, but because the department responsible had reorganized and the paperwork had somehow never been renewed. The digital monitoring reports still came in quarterly, and they all said the same thing: system nominal, gate functioning, no anomalies. Ray had accepted those reports because he had no reason not to. "But you've been down there," Ethan said. "The mechanical counter." "I don't know what that counts." "Manual overrides. Someone has been manually bypassing the gate control system, and it's not showing in the digital records because whoever is doing it knows how to keep it off the digital records." Ethan paused. "Do you know what that gate controls?" "Water, I assume." "It controls the primary drainage inlet for the eastern waterfront block. If that gate is stuck in bypass position, and there's a significant rain event, or if this building is demolished and the chamber is opened without properly sealing the gate first, the drainage failure would flood everything from this block to the marina. We're talking basements, ground floors, electrical systems. Depending on conditions, we could be talking about a serious event." Ray looked at him steadily. "How serious?" "I'd need to run numbers, but serious enough that someone should have flagged it a long time ago." Ethan met his eyes. "Someone may have known and not flagged it on purpose." The room was quiet for a moment. Somewhere upstairs, someone was watching television. He could hear the faint sound of a laugh track. "That's a big thing to say," Ray said. "I know." "You've been here 8 hours." "I know that too." Ethan leaned forward. "I need to see whatever documents the shelter has about this building. The original maintenance records, the city correspondence, anything related to the flood system. And I need to know who authorized the demolition sale and who's buying." Ray looked at him for a long time. Then he reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a thick manila folder and set it on the desk between them. "Been keeping this since the sale went through," he said. "Didn't know what to do with it. Lawyers said it wasn't relevant." He pushed it across. "I'm going to get some coffee. You want some?" "Yes," Ethan said. He opened the folder. The buyer of the parcel was a development LLC with a clean corporate name that meant nothing on its own. But the registered agent for the LLC was Dominic Farron of Whitmore and Associates, Clara's lawyer. Ethan sat back in his chair. The door didn't just open, it blew off its hinges. Outside, the November wind pushed against the shelter's old windows, and the building held, the way old buildings do. Not gracefully, not perfectly, but with the stubborn insistence of something that was built to last and hasn't finished lasting yet. The folder stayed open on Ray's desk until nearly midnight. Ray came back with 2 mugs of coffee, the kind that had been sitting on a burner too long, burnt at the edges and too strong in the middle. And he set one in front of Ethan without a word, and sat down and watched Ethan read. He didn't rush him. He didn't ask questions. He just drank his coffee and waited, which told Ethan something useful about the man. Ray understood that some things needed to be absorbed before they could be talked about. There were 43 pages in the folder: city correspondence, maintenance logs, the original sale notification, 2 letters from a housing advocacy organization that had filed a formal objection and been denied on procedural grounds. And near the back, paper clipped together and slightly water damaged at the corner, 3 pages from what appeared to be an engineering assessment, pages 4, 5, and 6 of a document that had clearly once been longer. Ethan read those 3 pages twice. Then he set them down and picked up his coffee and stared at the wall for a moment. "What is it?" Ray said. "This assessment." Ethan tapped the pages. "Pages 4 through 6. Do you have the rest of it?" "That's all I ever had. It came with the city's demolition notification as supporting documentation. They cited it as evidence the building was structurally beyond viable repair." "It doesn't say that. Not in these pages. These pages describe the flood chamber infrastructure in detail. The gate assembly, the drainage capacity, the load distribution. Whoever wrote this knew the system very well." He turned page 5 over, looking at the back. "There's no author listed, no firm name, no stamp. That's not standard for a structural assessment submitted to a city planning board. Those documents are supposed to be signed and sealed by a licensed engineer. So they left the name off. Or they removed it." Ethan set the pages down. The original document had more pages. Someone submitted a partial version. The question is what the missing pages said. Ray wrapped both hands around his mug. "And you think you know?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. He was thinking about a Tuesday afternoon 4 years ago, a site visit he'd done alone because the foundation's usual team was occupied with a gala in Miami. He'd come to this building with a clipboard and a flashlight and spent 6 hours in the basement and written a 31-page report that he'd submitted to Clara's foundation with the understanding that it would be filed with the city under the foundation's infrastructure consultation program. He had never seen what happened to that report after he submitted it. "I think I wrote the missing pages," he said. Ray put his mug down very carefully. "I consulted on this building 4 years ago," Ethan continued. "Flood infrastructure assessment. The foundation ran a city partnership program. I did site work. They submitted the documentation. I wrote a full report. 31 pages. He looked at the 3 water-damaged pages on the desk. "Pages 4 through 6 are mine. I recognize the formatting, the specific terminology I use for gate assembly descriptions." He pointed to a phrase in the middle of page 5. "I always write it that way. Axial load distribution on mechanical gate frame. That's a slightly unusual construction. Other engineers usually write it differently." Ray looked at the page, then he looked at Ethan. "So your report got cut up," he said. "The pages that are here describe the infrastructure. My guess is that the missing pages, the ones they didn't submit, contained my findings and recommendations, including, almost certainly, a recommendation that the floodgate system be tested and restored to full operational status before any structural changes were made to the building or the parcel. They pulled the conclusion and kept the description. The description makes the building sound complicated and old. The conclusion, if it said what I think it said, would have made demolition legally complicated." Ethan sat back. Someone needed the building to look like a straightforward teardown. Ray was quiet for a long moment. The building settled around them. That particular nighttime language of old structures, small creaks and distant thuds that you stop hearing after a while. Then he said, "The buyer, Whitmore and Associates. The registered agent is Clara's lawyer. That doesn't necessarily mean Clara is the direct buyer. It's routed through an LLC. But Dominic Farron doesn't file paperwork for clients he's not close to." Ethan felt something uncomfortable move through him when he said it. Not surprise exactly, more like the particular nausea of having a suspicion confirmed. "The foundation has been doing waterfront development work for 2 years. I heard about it at dinners. It was always framed as urban renewal, affordable housing mixed with commercial." He paused. "This parcel is right on the waterfront approach corridor. If you demolish this building and seal off the flood chamber without properly addressing the gate, you can build on this land. It looks safe on paper because the digital system will say everything is fine, but the digital system is being manually overridden. And when does it become a problem? When there's a serious water event, or when a future owner tries to excavate below grade for a parking structure or a foundation and opens the chamber without knowing what they're dealing with." Ethan pressed 2 fingers to his forehead. "The bypass keeps the gate from closing. If the gate can't close and water is pushing from the drainage network, you're not just flooding this block. The eastern waterfront corridor has 6 residential buildings, 2 commercial structures, and the lower level of the Harbor District Transit Station. Ray let that sit for a moment. How many people? He asked. In those buildings? Permanent residents? Commuters through the transit station? Ethan shook his head. Thousands. Outside, the wind picked up. Rain began to tap against the office window, a light rain, the beginning of what the weather had been threatening all day. Ray looked at the window. Then he looked back at Ethan. What do you need? He said. Well, he needed 3 things. The first was access to the basement flood chamber with enough time to properly document what he found. The second was a copy of the original 31-page report, which meant finding whoever at the foundation had received and processed it 4 years ago. The third was someone with standing to bring the information to the city planning board before the demolition vote in 12 days. He started with what he could do immediately, which was the basement. Gerald came with him, not because Ethan asked, but because Gerald appeared at the basement door at 7 the next morning with a better flashlight and a cup of coffee and said, "Ray told me you might be going down again. I know where the spare work lights are." Gerald turned out to be exactly the kind of person you want in a basement. Quiet, observant, willing to hold a light steady for 20 minutes without asking questions, and possessed of the specific practical knowledge that comes from having fixed things in a building for 4 months out of necessity. He knew where the circuit boxes were, which pipes had been recently patched, which sections of the lower floor had water intrusion after heavy rain. "Here," he said, pointing to a section of the lower chamber wall near the northeast corner. "After the October storms, there was water on the floor here, maybe 2 inches. Dried up in a couple of days. I assumed it was seepage." Ethan crouched and looked at the floor. The concrete was slightly stained, a tide line, faint but readable. "That's not seepage," he said. "Seepage comes in slowly, from below or through the wall. This pattern," he traced the edge of the stain with his finger, not touching it, "came from above and to the side. Something overflowed and drained here." He stood. If the gate was in bypass, and there was enough pressure in the drainage network from the October rain, water would have backed up into this chamber before finding a secondary outlet. So it already happened once. A small version of it. The October event wasn't a big enough storm to cause serious damage, but it was enough to give someone a preview. He turned and looked at the gate assembly again. And whoever is monitoring this knew about it, because someone came down here after October and reset the mechanical counter. Gerald frowned. "How do you know that?" "Because the counter reads 412 overrides. 412 is a lot of manual operations for a system that's supposed to be digitally automated. But if you look at the reset mechanism on the side of the housing," he pointed, "there's fresh tool marking on the screw heads. Someone used a non-standard driver on those screws recently. The paint around them is chipped." He pulled out his phone and photographed everything methodically. The counter, the screw heads, the tide line on the floor, the gate assembly, the digital control panel mounted on the opposite wall. They reset the counter to hit how many times the system had actually been manually overridden before that point. 412 is the count since the reset. Gerald stared at the counter. "That's not a mistake," he said slowly. "That's not something that just happens." "No," Ethan agreed. "It's not." He spent the rest of the morning in the basement, working methodically in the way that engineering work requires. Not fast, not dramatic, just careful and sequential, building a record. He measured what he could measure. He photographed everything. He wrote notes in the back pages of a spiral notebook he'd found in his box of things, using the specific technical language that would mean something to another engineer or to a court, if it came to that. Around noon, he went upstairs and ate a sandwich that Felicity handed him without asking if he wanted one. And then he called a number he hadn't called in nearly 3 years. It rang 4 times, and he was preparing for voicemail when the line picked up. "Ethan." The voice was cautious, surprised, not unwelcoming. Marcus Webb had been his closest friend from graduate school. They drifted in the particular way that people drift when one of them gets absorbed into a marriage and a social world that doesn't quite fit the other one. "I thought about calling you about 17 times and never did. What's going on?" "I need some help." Ethan sat on the edge of his bed in room 3C looking at his mother's photograph. "I'm in a situation, and there's a piece of it I can't get to from where I am." He explained it. Not everything, not the personal parts, but the technical and legal outline. The shelter, the flood chamber, the partial report, the mechanical counter. Marcus was a civil engineer who worked in municipal infrastructure consulting, which meant he understood everything Ethan was describing without needing it translated. When Ethan finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You said the original report was 31 pages," Marcus said. "Yes. And the city received pages 4 through 6, as far as I can tell." "Who submitted it?" "The Whitmore Foundation, Clara's foundation." Ethan kept his voice level. "It went through them because I was consulting under their infrastructure program. I submitted my full report to their program coordinator." "Who was the coordinator?" Ethan thought back. "A woman named Sandra Price. She left the foundation about 18 months ago. I don't have a current contact for her." "Okay." He heard Marcus writing something. "I can probably find her. I know some people in the municipal consulting world. She'd have had to go somewhere." A pause. "Ethan, if this is what it sounds like, if someone deliberately submitted a partial report to support a fraudulent demolition application, that's not just a housing issue. That's falsifying documentation submitted to a city planning board. That's potentially criminal." "I know." "Is this connected to Clara?" Ethan looked at his mother's photograph. The yellow rain jacket, the laugh that was aimed at someone off camera. His mother had a theory about people. Not a complicated theory, just a simple one. That most people, most of the time, were trying to do the right thing, and when they weren't, there was usually fear underneath it. He'd believed that for a long time. He wasn't sure what he believed right now. "The Buyers LLC uses Clara's lawyer as registered agent," he said. "Whether that goes further, I don't know yet." Marcus exhaled slowly. All right, give me 2 days on Sandra Priest. And Ethan?" He paused. "Are you okay? As a person, not as an engineer?" "I'm functional," Ethan said, which was the most honest answer he could give. "That's a terrible answer." "Yeah," Ethan said. "I know." Well, Sandra Priest called him on the second day, which was a Thursday, which meant dinner was from the Italian place on Harbor, and the dining room smelled like garlic and warm bread. Ethan took the call standing in the stairwell where it was quieter. She didn't waste time once she understood who he was. Her voice had the tight, careful quality of someone who has been sitting on something uncomfortable for a long time. "I left the foundation because of exactly this," she said. "Not this specifically. I didn't know about this specifically. But there was a pattern of documentation being handled in ways I wasn't comfortable with, reports being summarized rather than filed in full, findings being edited isn't the right word, selectively presented. My report," Ethan said, "the one I submitted 4 years ago, the flood infrastructure assessment for the Clement Street building. I remember it." A pause. "I processed it. I formatted it for city submission, and I handed it to Clara's deputy director for final review and authorization before it went out." "And what came out the other end?" The silence on the line was exactly long enough to confirm what he already suspected. "I didn't know until later," Sandra said. "I assumed it went out complete. I didn't see the submitted version until 6 months after I left, when a colleague mentioned the Clement Street demolition application, and I looked up the public filing." Her voice went flat. "It was 3 pages. I submitted 31. Ethan leaned against the stairwell wall. Above him, someone was walking down the hall with heavy footsteps, and somewhere a door opened and closed. "Sandra," he said, "are you willing to say that, formally?" Another silence, longer this time. "I've been asking myself that question for a while," she said. "I have a job now. A good one. I have a mortgage. I have a kid in her 2nd year of college." She stopped. "I also have a copy." Ethan went still. "I kept a copy of your full report," Sandra said. "The complete 31 pages with your signature and seal. I keep copies of everything I submit. It's just a habit I have from years of working in documentation. I never throw anything away." A pause that felt heavy. "I don't know if that helps you." "It helps me enormously," Ethan said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "If I do this, if I go on record, I need to understand what I'm walking into. You'd be a witness confirming that the document submitted to the city was an altered version of the original. You'd be confirming the original existed and what it contained. You're not being asked to accuse anyone of anything beyond what you directly know. Clara Whitmore has a lot of lawyers." "I know. And a lot of friends in this city." "I know that too." Ethan was quiet for a moment. I'm not asking you to do anything that isn't true, just to say the true thing. Sandra made a sound, not quite a laugh, something more rueful than that. You know what's funny? Your report was good, really good. Most of the consultants who came through the program wrote adequate reports. Yours was the kind of report that actually cared about what it was describing. I remembered it. A pause. I'll think about it. Give me until the weekend. The vote is in 10 days. I know. Give me until the weekend. She hung up. Ethan stood in the stairwell for a moment and let himself feel the particular fragile quality of a situation that has a chance but isn't safe. Then he went down to dinner, because the Italian place's lasagna was apparently excellent, and Felicity had told him twice that he needed to eat a real meal. He ate next to a man he hadn't met before, a newcomer, arrived that afternoon, who gave his name as Bertrand and was in his late 50s and had the particular shell-shocked quality of someone who had entered the shelter recently enough that everything still felt temporary and wrong. Ethan didn't push. He'd learned already that in a place like this, people talked when they were ready. Bertrand waited until they were halfway through dinner before he said, I used to manage the maintenance contracts for the Eastern Waterfront municipal buildings. 20 years. Ethan set his fork down. Retired 2 years ago, Bertrand continued. Lost my place in a fire. Temporary situation. He said the last part with the careful emphasis of a man who has told himself the same thing enough times that he's not sure he believes it anymore. What about you? Divorce, Ethan said. And I'm an engineer. Bertrand looked at him sideways. What kind? Civil. Flood infrastructure, mostly. Bertrand chewed his food for a moment. Then you probably know more about this building than you should, he said. If you've been paying attention. I've been paying attention. Bertrand nodded slowly. The maintenance contract on the Clement Street flood chamber was supposed to be renewed 2 years ago. I flagged the lapse before I retired. I filed the paperwork myself, sent it to 3 different departments. Nobody acted on it. He pushed his tray slightly to one side. 8 months before I retired, we got a request from the Whitmore Foundation for emergency access to the lower chamber. Said they were doing a donor infrastructure tour. I signed off on it because they had city partnership status, and the paperwork looked right. He paused. But the tech I sent with them, young guy, sharp. He told me afterward that one of the foundation staff had asked him to demonstrate the manual override function, show them how it worked. He thought it was odd, but figured it was a donor education thing. Ethan kept his face neutral. The tech also told me, Bertrand said, that when he left, the gate was in bypass. He assumed the foundation rep would restore normal operation, standard procedure. He looked at Ethan directly for the first time. I put it in my notes. Never turned into a formal report because by then I was 3 weeks from retirement and everything was getting handed off, and honestly, he stopped. Honestly, I thought I was being paranoid. Old maintenance guys get paranoid. You weren't being paranoid, Ethan said. No. Bertrand was quiet. I figured that out when I looked up the demolition filing from the library computer last month and saw the maintenance history had been wiped clean in the city system. He picked up his fork again. Digital records. Somebody with system access went in and cleaned it. The dining room was warm and loud around them. Silverware and conversation, and someone's radio playing from the back of the kitchen. Felicity was arguing cheerfully with Dev about something. Gerald was telling a story to a man Ethan didn't know yet. The teenager in the corner was still doing homework. Ethan looked at Bertrand. Would you be willing to tell someone what you just told me? He said. Bertrand turned his fork over in his hand. He had the roughened hands of someone who had worked physical jobs alongside desk jobs his whole life. The particular combination of calluses and ink stains. I've been sitting on this for 2 years, he said. Sitting on it and not doing anything about it because I couldn't see what I'd do, where it would go, who would care. He looked at Ethan. Are you saying there's somewhere for it to go? I'm saying there might be. I'm saying I'm trying to build the place for it to go. Bertrand considered this for a long moment. Then he said, You're not what I expected when Ray said there was a new resident asking questions. What did you expect? I don't know, someone louder. He set the fork down. All right, yeah, tell me what you need. That night, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed in room 3C after lights out, with his phone's brightness turned low, and looked through everything he had, his photographs from the basement, his notes from the spiral notebook, the 3 pages from Ray's folder, and a new note he'd added that afternoon with everything Bertrand had told him. The shape of it was becoming clear. Not complete. There were still pieces missing, still things he needed to confirm, but clear enough that he could see what it was. Someone had arranged a guided access to the flood chamber under the cover of a donor tour and used that access to engage the manual bypass. Then they had kept the bypass active by periodically returning to reset it, or having someone return to reset it. The digital system had been cleaned of any record of these visits. A maintenance contract lapse had been allowed to persist, eliminating regular independent inspection. And when the demolition plan moved forward, the engineering assessment submitted to support it had been surgically trimmed to remove the pages that would have raised questions about the floodgate. The plan was functional, if it worked. Demolish the building, seal or fill the chamber without addressing the gate. Build on the parcel. The digital system would continue to say everything was fine because the digital system had been compromised. The flood risk would be invisible until it wasn't. What the plan hadn't accounted for was a mechanical counter behind cracked glass in a sub-basement, quietly marking every time someone came down and pushed the manual lever. The kind of old, dumb analog instrument that keeps working after the digital infrastructure has been quietly rearranged, because it doesn't know the difference between official and unofficial. It just counts. His mother had put that counter there. He didn't know that for certain, not yet. But he knew her work, and he knew this flood network, and he knew the way she thought about redundancy. Catherine Mercer Calloway had not trusted single points of failure. She had built backups into backups, and she had been particularly suspicious of anything that could be altered after the fact. She had been right to be. Ethan turned off his phone and lay back on the mattress and looked at the dark ceiling. His mother's photograph was a pale rectangle against the wall. He couldn't see her face in the dark, just the shape of the frame. He had 8 days until the vote. He had a partial report, a witness who might testify, a maintenance official with direct knowledge of the bypass event, and a basement full of physical evidence that needed to be formally documented by someone with credentials. The credentials were the problem. He had walked away from active licensure 2 years ago, let it lapse when it came up for renewal, because by then the consulting work had dried up, and Clara had said it wasn't worth the fee, and he had, in a moment of weakness he was still ashamed of, agreed with her. He was not a licensed engineer at the moment. His documentation was good and his knowledge was real, but without a current license, he couldn't submit a formal assessment to the planning board. Everything he'd built would need someone else's seal on it. He lay there for a while thinking about that. Then he picked up his phone again and sent a text to Marcus Webb. "I need you to come look at a basement." Marcus replied 4 minutes later. "When?" "Tomorrow," Ethan wrote back, "and bring your seal." He put the phone face down on the nightstand. The building settled around him, and the rain had started again outside, heavier now than the night before, the season finally committing to itself. And somewhere below him, in the sub-basement that the city's digital system claimed was operating normally, the floodgate sat locked open in bypass position, and the mechanical counter held perfectly still, waiting. Marcus Webb showed up the next morning in a car that had seen better decades, wearing a jacket with a coffee stain on the left sleeve, and carrying a hard-sided equipment case that Ethan recognized from graduate school, the same case, apparently, which said something about Marcus's relationship with both his tools and his budget. He stood on the sidewalk in front of the shelter and looked at the building for a long moment before he said anything. "It's holding up better than it should," he said. "That's what I thought." 64 people in there? Give or take a few that came in this week? Marcus picked up his case. "Show me the basement." They spent 4 hours down there. Marcus worked the way Ethan remembered him working, methodically, without any wasted motion, talking through what he was observing in the particular half-mumbled running commentary that engineers use when they're thinking out loud and don't particularly care if anyone is following along. He measured. He photographed. He ran his hand along the gate assembly and the pipe connections with the careful attention of someone reading something written in a language he knew well. The mechanical counter stopped him, the way it had stopped Ethan. He stood in front of it for a full 2 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "Your mother built this." It wasn't a question. "I think so," Ethan said. The counter design is consistent with her redundancy philosophy. She didn't trust single-source verification. She was right not to. Marcus crouched and looked at the screw heads on the reset housing. "These are recent. Someone used a flathead on a Phillips head screw. See the scoring?" He stood back up. "This counter has been reset within the last few months. The corrosion pattern on the original screws versus these marks. Someone went at these in a hurry. October, Ethan said, after the minor water event. Marcus looked at the tide line on the floor, which Ethan had marked with a piece of chalk borrowed from the shelter's common room. Yeah, that tracks. He walked the perimeter of the chamber, looking up at the ceiling, running his flashlight along the joints where the chamber walls met the building foundation above. You know what concerns me as much as the gate? Tell me. This chamber was designed as an active flood control element, which means the building above it was engineered with the assumption that this chamber would function. The load distribution in the northeast corner, the drainage channels in the floor, all of it assumes the chamber is operational. He pointed his flashlight at the northeast ceiling joint. If this chamber is not operational and you get a serious water event, not even a catastrophic one, just a sustained heavy rainfall during a high tide window, the hydrostatic pressure that builds up has nowhere to go. It doesn't just flood the chamber, it pushes upward into the building foundation. The settling crack you probably noticed on the third floor landing? Northeast corner. It's been getting worse, Marcus said. Not from age, from pressure cycles. Every time water backs up in here and then recedes, it moves the foundation slightly. Over time, that adds up. He lowered the flashlight. This building is in more trouble than it looks, Ethan, not from neglect, from active interference with the system it was built around. Ethan stood there and felt the weight of that settle over him, not just the technical weight of it, but the human weight. 64 people sleeping above a foundation that was being quietly undermined by someone who had decided a piece of waterfront real estate was worth more than the safety calculation. Will you seal a report? He said. Marcus looked at him. That's why I'm here. I need it before the weekend. The vote is in 8 days. I'll have a draft by tomorrow night. Full assessment, gate system status, structural implications, recommended remediation. He picked up his case. And Ethan, the report is going to say clearly that this gate system was deliberately interfered with. I can't write around that. The evidence doesn't allow for any other interpretation. I know. That's going to make some people very uncomfortable. Good, Ethan said, and meant it. Sandra Priest called on Saturday morning 2 days later than she'd promised, which Ethan had prepared himself for by deciding not to count on it, and then counting on it anyway, the way you can't help doing when something matters. I'll do it, she said. No preamble, no additional deliberation. Whatever she'd been working through, she'd finished working through it. I have the complete 31-page report with your original signature and engineering seal. I'm prepared to submit a sworn statement confirming that I processed this document and submitted it to the Foundation's Deputy Director for authorization, and that the version subsequently filed with the City Planning Board was not the complete document I submitted. Sandra, I'm not finished. Her voice was steady, but she was talking slightly faster than normal, the way people do when they've rehearsed something and are committed to getting through it. I'm also prepared to state that in the 18 months before I left the Foundation, I observed a pattern of documentation being altered or selectively filed, and that I raised concerns about this internally on 2 occasions and was told the Foundation's legal team reviewed all submissions for appropriate scope. A brief silence. That last part is what took me until Saturday. I needed to decide if I was willing to say it. It could complicate things for you. It could, but here's the thing I kept coming back to. I'm a person who keeps copies of everything because I believe documentation matters. And if I believe that, then I have to be willing to use the documentation. She exhaled. Where do I send the report? He gave her Marcus's contact information because Marcus was the one assembling the formal package. When he hung up, he sat for a moment on the edge of his bed and looked at the water-stained ceiling of room 3C and felt something that wasn't quite relief. It was too early for relief, but was in the vicinity of it. The shape of what he was building was becoming something a city planning board could actually look at. A sealed engineering assessment, a witness with the original document, a former municipal official with direct knowledge of the bypass event. It still wasn't enough to stop anything by itself. He knew that. In 12 years of watching Clara and the Foundation operate, he had learned that documents and witnesses were the beginning of a fight, not the end of one. The people on the other side of this had lawyers and relationships and the particular advantage of being the kind of people that institutions were inclined to believe. He had 8 days and a shelter full of people who had nowhere else to go. He went downstairs to find Ray. Ray was in his office, which was where Ray always was, surrounded by his filing cabinets and his stacked binders and his decades-deep knowledge of how to keep a place like this running on a budget that was never quite enough. He was on the phone when Ethan appeared in the doorway, and he held up one finger without looking up and finished the call. Something about a linen delivery that had been wrong 3 weeks in a row, and set the phone down. "Webb's assessment," Ethan said, coming in and sitting. "It'll be ready by Monday." Combined with Sandra Priest's statement and Bertrand's account of the bypass event, we have a package that can go to the planning board and request a delay in the demolition vote pending independent review. Can they grant a delay? They can. It's procedurally allowed when new structural or safety information is submitted within the 10-day window before a vote. Marcus knows the relevant statutes. He's going to include the procedural request in the submission. Ray folded his hands on the desk. "And you think they'll grant it?" "I think they'll have to, if the submission is complete and properly documented. Ignoring a sealed engineer's assessment that says a demolition carries flood risk for the surrounding district, that's not a position any city official wants to be in publicly." Ethan paused. "The problem is the timeline. The submission needs to be filed by Wednesday to be within the window. That gives us 4 days to finalize everything. And if they don't delay the vote? Then we're in emergency territory. We'd need to go to a court for an injunction, which is harder and faster and requires an attorney who—" Ethan stopped. Ray looked at him. "Who you can't pay. I don't currently have access to the resources I would normally have access to." He said it plainly, without self-pity, because self-pity was a luxury he'd decided not to afford. "Clara's restructuring of the accounts left me with $4,000. Marcus is doing the assessment as a favor. Sandra is doing her part because she believes it's right. Bertrand is just a decent person in a bad situation. But an emergency injunction attorney is not something any of us can absorb." Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he opened the bottom drawer again, the same drawer that had produced the manila folder on the first night, and took out a business card and set it on the desk. Ethan picked it up. The card was for a woman named Judith Crane, with the name of a firm below it that he didn't recognize. "Housing advocacy attorney," Ray said. "She's been working the shelter's case pro bono since the demolition notice. She lost the procedural objection, but she's been looking for something with more weight to bring back." He nodded at the card. "I'd say sealed engineering assessments and falsified documentation qualify as more weight." Ethan looked at the card. Then he looked at Ray. "You've been building this too," he said. Ray shrugged, which was not quite agreement and not quite denial. "I've been running this shelter for 22 years. You learn to keep pieces around in case something comes together." He paused. "I didn't know what would come together. I just kept the pieces." Judith Crane was a small woman in her early 60s with silver hair cut practically short and the particular brand of unsentimental directness that long-term advocacy work either produces or selects for. She met Ethan and Ray on Monday morning in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the shelter, sat down, ordered a black coffee without looking at the menu and said, "Show me what you have." Ethan showed her. She read through Marcus's draft assessment, completed late Sunday night and delivered by email at 11:43, because Marcus had never been a person who understood that other people needed sleep, with the focused attention of someone who reads technical documents for a living and knows exactly what to look for. She read Sandra's statement. She read Bertrand's account, which Ethan had taken down in writing and had Bertrand sign. She looked at Ethan's photographs from the basement. When she was done, she drank some of her coffee and said, "You know what the other side is going to do. I have some ideas. They're going to argue that the mechanical counter is unreliable, that its readings don't constitute proof of deliberate interference, that the gate being in bypass could be the result of a maintenance error rather than intentional action. They're going to question Marcus Webb's independence since he's your personal contact, and they're going to argue that the document discrepancy could be an administrative error." She set down her cup. "None of those arguments are good, but they don't need to be good. They just need to be enough to muddy the water until the vote happens." "So we need something cleaner," Ethan said. "You need something that speaks for itself." She looked at him directly. "The mechanical counter is your best piece of evidence, and it's also your most vulnerable one. If they can raise doubts about what it measures or whether it's been tampered with, by you, they'll imply. It weakens everything built around it. The counter needs independent corroboration. Someone who knew what it was and how it worked, preferably someone who was there when it was installed." Ethan thought about that. "I might be that person," he said. "My mother designed the original flood control network. I grew up around her engineering projects. I've been in this chamber before, during the site inspection 4 years ago. He paused. But to say that convincingly, without it being dismissed as self-serving, I'd have to say it as myself. Not as Clara Whitmore's husband, not as a consulting engineer who let his license lapse. He looked at the table. As Ethan Calloway Mercer. Judith waited. My mother was Catherine Mercer Calloway. She founded Mercer Calloway Engineering. The firm designed the Eastern Waterfront Flood Network for the city in 1987. The company was absorbed into Harrington Infrastructure Group after she died, but her original design archive is held in trust. I'm the sole heir to that trust. He said it the way you say something you've been not saying for a long time, carefully, feeling the weight of it as it comes out. I've kept that out of my public life for 6 years. Catherine died the same year I married Clara. Everything got complicated at once, and I chose to step back from it, from what the name meant. Why? Judith said. Not accusatory, just a genuine question from someone who needed to understand. Because the Mercer Calloway name comes with a specific kind of attention. Money, status, the expectations that go with an engineering dynasty. Clara had that world already. I didn't want to be another version of it. I wanted to be... He stopped, aware of how it was going to sound. I wanted to be just an engineer, not an heir to anything, just someone who did the work. Judith was quiet for a moment. How did Clara feel about that? She respected it. He paused. Or she said she did. I think it also suited her. A husband who was competent but not prominent, useful but not competitive. He caught himself. That's unkind. I don't actually know what she thought. I know what I observed. If you put the Mercer Calloway name on this, Judith said, several things happen. You become the legal inheritor of the infrastructure safety obligation for that flood network, which means you have standing to demand access for inspection and to submit findings to the city. It also means the planning board can't dismiss the assessment as coming from a non-credentialed party. The Mercer Calloway Trust has a legal relationship with the city that predates the current administration by decades. She turned her cup on the table. It also means you become a much larger target. Clara's lawyers will immediately pivot to attacking your motives. Former spouse, contested assets, personal vendetta. I know. You'll need to be prepared for that to get ugly. I know that too. She looked at him for a moment with the evaluating look of someone who has seen a lot of people say they were prepared for things and then discover they weren't. Whatever she found in his face apparently satisfied her because she nodded. All right, she said. We file Wednesday. Marcus finalizes the assessment with your formal co-authorization as Mercer Calloway Trust beneficiary. Sandra's statement goes in as an exhibit. Bertrand's account goes in as a supporting declaration. I write the cover brief and the procedural delay request. She picked up her pen. And we pray... She stopped, caught herself. And we hope the planning board has at least one member who takes infrastructure safety more seriously than political relationships. What are the odds of that? Better than they were before you showed up, she said, which was not exactly reassuring but was at least honest. The filing went in on Wednesday at 2 p.m. By 4 o'clock, Ethan had received a call from a number he didn't recognize, and when he answered it, the voice on the other end was Dominic Farron. He had expected this. He had expected it sooner, actually. Mr. Calloway, Farron said, I think we should talk. We're talking. In person would be better. This is a sensitive matter, and there are aspects of it that I think you'd prefer to discuss privately. I don't have a lot of private spaces at the moment. I'm living in a shelter. A brief pause on the line. I'm aware of your current situation. I'd like to help address it. I'm sure you would. Mr. Calloway, Mercer, Ethan said. My name is Ethan Calloway Mercer. I've notified the planning board of that fact as part of today's filing. I'd prefer you use the correct name. The pause this time was slightly longer. Mr. Mercer, the filing you've made today contains some serious allegations. Allegations that, if they were to be taken out of context, could cause significant reputational harm to individuals and organizations that have done a great deal of good for this city. The filing doesn't make allegations. It presents documented evidence and requests an independent review before a demolition vote proceeds. If the review finds nothing problematic, the vote proceeds on schedule. The timing is determined by when I found the evidence, Ethan said. I found it 6 days ago. I've moved as quickly as I could. He kept his voice level. Is there something specific you wanted to say to me, Dominic? Or is this a general call to suggest I should reconsider? Farron's voice shifted slightly. Not warmer, but more direct, the professional courtesy stripped back a layer. The recording you have of the bypass event, the documentation about the counter, there are questions about chain of custody, about whether your presence in that basement constitutes authorized access. I'm a resident of the building. Residents have access to common areas. The basement is a common mechanical area. I walked down a staircase. With an intention to gather evidence. With an intention to understand a building I was living in. Ethan paused. I'm going to give you some advice, Dominic, for whatever it's worth. The mechanical counter is not the only record. There are human beings who are present for events connected to this system, people who are willing to speak. A sealed engineer's assessment does not disappear because a lawyer makes a phone call. If the strategy here is to challenge my access to the basement, that's going to be a very public and very unproductive conversation. Silence on the line, then, Clara would like to speak with you. Ethan had expected that less than he'd expected Farron. About what, he said, and was annoyed at himself for how careful his voice had gone. I'm not in a position to characterize her intentions. She asked me to extend the invitation. He stood in the stairwell of the shelter, his back against the wall, looking at the scuffed landing and the handrail that Gerald had tightened last week with a wrench he'd borrowed from the hardware store. Above him, someone was moving around on the second floor. Below, he could hear the faint sound of the dinner preparations starting in the kitchen. Tell her I'll think about it, he said. He hung up and stood there for a moment. Then he went downstairs because it was Thursday and dinner was from the Italian place, and he had told Felicity he would be there for it. But Marcus called him that night. Not about the filing, about something he'd found when he went back to cross-reference the digital maintenance records against the physical evidence from the chamber. The digital system logged 4 access events in the past 14 months, Marcus said. All 4 show up as routine Foundation partnership inspections. All 4 are authorized under Clara's Foundation's city partnership status. And all 4, based on the timestamps, occurred within 48 hours of rainfall events that would have created pressure elevation in the drainage network. Ethan sat very still. Someone was coming in after rain events, he said, checking that the bypass was holding, resetting it if the pressure had nudged it toward normal operation, and logging it as a routine inspection so it wouldn't raise flags. Marcus was quiet for a moment. This is not a system that was bypassed and then forgot about. This is a system that was being actively maintained in bypass condition. Someone knew what they were doing and kept doing it. The recording, Ethan said, from Bertrand, when the Foundation staff asked the city tech to demonstrate the manual override. That was the initial setup. The 4 subsequent visits were the maintenance. That's how I read it. Marcus paused. Ethan, this is more deliberate than I initially assessed. This isn't negligence and it isn't a maintenance error. Someone made a decision and executed it over 14 months. I'm going to revise the assessment language to reflect that. It'll be stronger and it'll be more uncomfortable for whoever reads it. Make it as strong as the evidence supports, Ethan said. Not stronger. Understood. But right now the evidence support's pretty strong. After he hung up, Ethan sat for a long time without doing anything. The room was quiet. His roommates came and went on their own schedules, and tonight he had the room to himself for a rare hour. The photograph of his mother was a pale shape against the wall, visible even in the low light because he'd moved it to where the small glow from the window streetlight caught the edge of the frame. He thought about Clara. Not about what she'd done. Not yet. But about who she was, the actual person he had spent 11 years beside. She was not a simple person. She had built something real with the Foundation, had genuinely helped people, had worked in rooms full of powerful and self-interested individuals, and maintained her own direction with a stubbornness that he had always admired even when it was aimed at him. She was not stupid. She was not careless, which meant that whatever this was, it had been a decision, made clearly, maintained actively, with a full understanding of what was underneath the building. That was harder to sit with than carelessness would have been. He picked up his phone and sent a message to Judith. Farron called. Clara wants to meet. Recommend I decline until after the board receives the submission. Judith replied in 4 minutes. Absolutely decline. Any conversation with her before the board acts is a conversation her lawyers will try to use. Say nothing, attend nothing, sign nothing. He typed back. Understood. He put the phone away and looked at the ceiling for a while. The call from the planning board came the next morning, 41 hours after the filing. It was not the call he'd wanted. It was a clerk, reading from a script, informing him that the submission had been received and was under procedural review, and that the board's legal team had raised questions about the standing of the Mercer-Callaway Trust designation, and would require additional documentation before the delay request could be considered. Judith was on the phone with him within 15 minutes of that call. "They're stalling," she said. "The additional documentation they're asking for exists. It's standard trust paperwork, and they know we can produce it. What they're doing is buying time." Time for what? The vote is in 5 days. If they can keep us producing paperwork until Thursday, they can plausibly hold the delay request in procedural review through the vote date and then moot the question because the vote has already happened. Ethan stood in the shelter's common room, where Felicity and Dev and Gerald were watching a morning news program on the wall-mounted television. They weren't paying attention to his call, or they were being polite about not paying attention, which was the same thing in practice. "What do we do?" he said. "We produce the paperwork today. I'll call the trust administrator. Do you have a contact?" "I'll get you one in the next hour." "And we go public," Judith said. "I've been avoiding that because public attention cuts both ways, but at this point the delay tactic is a sign they're more worried about the substance than they want to admit. If this filing becomes a news story, sealed engineer's assessment, falsified documentation, flood risk in a populated area, the board is going to have a much harder time quietly running out the clock. You want to go to press. I want to give someone the documentation and let them decide if it's a story. I think they'll decide it is." A pause. "There's a reporter at the Harbor Chronicle, Diane Yee. She covers city planning and infrastructure. She's been following the shelter demolition case for 2 months. If I send her the filing and she publishes before Thursday, the board is going to have a very uncomfortable few days." Ethan looked across the common room. Felicity had turned from the television and was watching him with the quiet attention of someone who has learned, over many years, when something important is happening nearby. "Do it," he said. The story ran Thursday morning, 36 hours before the scheduled vote. Diane Yee had written it carefully, not sensationally, which was both her instinct and, Ethan suspected, a deliberate choice to make it harder to dismiss. The headline was straightforward. "Shelter demolition halted by new flood risk filing. City documents show discrepancy in engineering records." The story laid out the facts in the order they mattered: the mechanical evidence, the falsified submission, the independent assessment, the former municipal official's account of the bypass event. It named the filing and the Mercer-Callaway Trust designation and quoted from Marcus's assessment in specific technical terms that could not easily be simplified or distorted. It did not name Clara directly. It named the Whitmore Foundation and the buyer, LLC. A careful reader could connect the dots. Ethan had not asked Diane to make the connection explicit, and she had not, which he thought was the right call. By 10 o'clock that morning, Ethan's phone had received 47 missed calls. 3 were from numbers he recognized: Marcus, Judith, Marcus's office line. The other 44 were from numbers he didn't. And then, at 11:14, Clara called. He was sitting on a bench in the small park half a block from the shelter, because the inside had become difficult to be in since the story ran. Not hostile, but full of the kind of attention and feeling that he didn't know what to do with yet. Felicity had hugged him that morning with the full-bodied certainty of a woman who has decided something is right, and he had stood there not knowing what to do with his hands, which was the most honest representation of where he was emotionally. His phone rang. Her name on the screen. He answered. "Ethan." Her voice was different from the voice in the lobby. The efficiency was gone. Something raw had replaced it, something he couldn't fully identify. Not guilt, not quite, but a kind of stripped-down reality. "I wanted to say something before it gets worse." "Okay." "I didn't know about the flood risk. I want you to know that. The bypass. I authorized the bypass during the donor tour because the project team said it was a temporary demonstration. I was told it was restored afterward." A pause. "I believe that." Ethan looked at the park. A handful of trees that had lost most of their leaves, a pigeon working at something on the pavement, an elderly man on a bench across the path reading a newspaper. Normal things. "Someone on your team kept it active," he said. "I know that now." "And the report. My 31-page report." A longer pause. I knew the submitted version was shorter. I was told the full version contained proprietary infrastructure information that couldn't be publicly filed, that it was legally appropriate to file a summary. She stopped. I didn't read your report, Ethan. I trusted that the process was handled correctly. He thought about that. About what it meant to trust a process. About whether trusting a process was the same as taking responsibility for what the process produced. The building has 64 people in it, he said, and a floodgate that's been locked open for over a year. Whatever the intention was, that's what exists. I know. Her voice was very quiet. I know that. The silence between them stretched out. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of two people who had shared a great deal of their lives and were now on opposite sides of something real and couldn't pretend otherwise. Dominic is going to advise me to push back on your filing, she said. He thinks there are procedural grounds. There aren't, Ethan said, not strong ones. I know. Another pause. I'm going to override him on one thing. The demolition vote. I'm going to request it be postponed pending the city's independent review. Voluntarily. She said it the way someone says something they've decided and don't intend to unsay. It's the right thing to do. Whatever else is true about this, that part is clear. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. The wind moved through the nearly bare trees with a sound like something exhaling. That's the right call, he said. Yes. A pause. I know we have a great deal else to work out. The lawyers, the separation, all of it. I'm not asking for anything right now. I just wanted to say that directly, without Dominic in the room. He didn't say anything for a moment. I heard you, he said finally. She hung up. He sat on the bench in the park with the dead phone in his hand and looked at the pigeon and the bare trees and the old man reading his newspaper and tried to figure out what he felt. Not resolution. Nothing was resolved. Not forgiveness. That was a longer road than a single phone call. Something smaller and more immediate. The particular sensation of a situation that has been moving in one direction suddenly finding a different channel. He called Judith. She's requesting a voluntary postponement, he said when Judith answered. A brief silence. That changes things. It doesn't change the underlying evidence. No, but it changes the posture of the board review significantly. If the foundation is requesting the delay rather than fighting it. Judith paused, and he could hear her thinking. The city investigation still happens. The documentation discrepancy still needs to be formally addressed. The gate system still needs to be remediated. But the immediate demolition threat to the shelter is lifted. For now. For now, she agreed. How are you feeling about this? I don't know yet. He looked at the old man across the path, who had lowered his newspaper and was looking at the sky with the expression of someone making a weather assessment. I think I need to see the vote postponed officially before I feel anything about it. Reasonable, Judith said. The board meets tomorrow. If Clara's counsel files the postponement request today, it'll be on the agenda. I'll be there. It was cold, but it was quiet, and he needed quiet more than warmth at the moment. The old man across the path had gone back to his newspaper. The pigeon had found whatever it was looking for. The trees moved in the wind with the patient, indifferent grace of things that have outlasted a lot of human urgency and expect to outlast more. Tomorrow he would sit in a city hall hearing room and say his real name in public for the first time in 6 years. He would sit there as Ethan Calloway Mercer, sole heir to a dead woman's engineering legacy, and he would ask a city board to let a machine speak the truth that the digital systems had been taught to hide. Tonight, he walked back to the shelter, went upstairs, sat on the edge of his bed, and looked at his mother's photograph in the fading afternoon light, and thought that she would have had something exact and useful to say about all of this, and that he would never know what it was, and that was one of the things about losing someone that nobody warned you about, the way you keep arriving at moments where you need them, and they are permanently, irrevocably absent. He sat with that for a while. Then he got up and went down to dinner. The City Planning Board met on Friday morning in a room on the 4th floor of the Municipal Services Building that smelled of old carpet and recycled air, and the particular institutional staleness of a space that has hosted too many difficult conversations to retain any particular one of them. The room held about 60 people when full. It was full. Ethan arrived 20 minutes early with Judith, who was carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had been through several wars and had the organized interior of someone who had learned the hard way that you could never find what you needed at the wrong moment. She had dressed with the deliberate neutrality of a person who understood that appearance in a hearing room was a form of argument: a dark blazer, no jewelry, flat shoes. She looked like someone whose only interest was the facts, which was exactly the impression she intended. Ethan had put on the best clothes he had access to, which were the clothes he'd been wearing the day he left the Harborview Tower: dark trousers, a gray shirt, a jacket that had spent 10 days folded in a duffel bag and showed it. He had borrowed an iron from the shelter's laundry room and done what he could. He looked like a man who had recently lost his comfortable life and was not trying to pretend otherwise, which was also, in its way, a form of argument. Ray had come. So had Felicity, who had put on a good coat and her best shoes and sat in the third row with her hands folded in her lap and her chin at a particular angle that suggested she had survived worse than this and expected to survive this too. Gerald was there. Bertrand was there. Dev had come, even though he had a job interview that afternoon that he'd rescheduled to be here, which he mentioned only once and without making anything of it. Sandra Priest was in the second row, which Ethan hadn't expected. She gave him a brief nod when he came in, the nod of someone who has made a decision and is committed to it and doesn't need it commented on. The board had 7 members. They sat at a long table at the front of the room with the organized discomfort of people who had read enough of the filing to know this was not going to be a routine proceeding. The chair was a man named Walter Odom, mid-60s, with the patient, slightly exhausted quality of someone who had been running difficult meetings for a long time and had long since stopped expecting them to be easy. Clara was not there. Her legal team was, 3 of them, in suits that cost more than Marcus Webb's car, arranged in a row with the coordinated stillness of people who had done this many times and knew exactly how to occupy space in a hearing room. Dominic Farron was not among them, which surprised Ethan until he thought about it and decided it made sense. Farron's name was on the LLC filing. His presence would make a connection the legal team probably preferred to leave undrawn. Odom called the session to order at 9 o'clock. He went through the procedural preamble in the way of a man who respects procedure and also understands that everyone in the room is waiting for him to get past it. Then he addressed the filing directly. The Mercer-Callaway trust submission, the delay request, and the voluntary postponement notice filed by the Whitmore Foundation's counsel the previous afternoon. "We have before us," Odom said, "a sealed engineering assessment, a witness declaration regarding documentation discrepancy, a supporting account from a former municipal maintenance official, and a voluntary postponement request from the development party. We also have a motion from the board's own legal team to defer the delay request pending trust verification." He looked up from his notes and surveyed the room with the steady patience of someone who has already made up his mind about something and is going through the proper steps to get there. "I'm going to recommend we set aside the deferral motion. The trust documentation was received this morning and has been verified by the board's administrative office. The Mercer-Callaway Trust has legal standing." The 3 lawyers in the expensive suits did not visibly react, which told Ethan they had expected this. "I'm also going to recommend," Odom continued, "that we not vote on the demolition today. The issues raised in this filing, whether or not all of them are ultimately substantiated, represent the kind of safety questions that a planning board has an obligation to take seriously before proceeding. We are not a court. It is not our job to adjudicate the documentary discrepancy or assign responsibility for the gate system status. But it is absolutely our job to ensure that a demolition we approve does not create the kind of flood risk described in this assessment." He set his papers down. "This vote is postponed pending independent municipal review of the floodgate system. I'll entertain discussion." The discussion lasted 40 minutes. The Foundation's lawyers raised every procedural point available to them, all of which Odom and Judith handled with the calm efficiency of people who had anticipated the arguments and prepared for them. None of the lawyers' arguments were stupid. They were careful, technically grounded, and delivered with the professional smoothness of people who were very good at their jobs. They simply weren't good enough for what was on the other side of the table, which was a sealed engineering assessment and a signed declaration and a room full of shelter residents who had gotten dressed in their best clothes to be there. When the discussion concluded, Odom formalized the postponement. The room exhaled. Felicity made a sound that was not quite a word, something between a sigh and a quiet exclamation. and reached over and squeezed Gerald's arm. And Gerald looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man trying to maintain composure and not entirely succeeding. Ethan sat in his chair and felt, not triumph, something quieter than that. A small clearing in a difficult landscape. The demolition was postponed. The flood system would be independently reviewed. The shelter would remain open while that review happened. These were not final victories. They were breathing room. But breathing room was what 64 people needed, and they had it. After the session ended, when the room was beginning to empty and people were standing and talking in the low, released way of those who have just come through something stressful, Odom made his way along the side of the room toward Ethan. He stopped and extended a hand, and Ethan shook it. "Your mother built a good system," Odom said. "She did. I remember when the Eastern Waterfront Network went in. I was a junior city planner. I attended the completion review." He paused. She was very precise about the redundancies. She said digital systems are only as reliable as the people who maintain them, so you build the mechanical backup to be independent of human decision-making. He looked at Ethan steadily. "I didn't know you were her son until yesterday. I kept it quiet." "I understand." He seemed to. "The independent review team will need access to the chamber starting Monday. Is that manageable with the shelter's schedule?" "Talk to Ray Okafor. He's the shelter director. He'll make it work." Odom nodded, shook his hand once more, and moved on. Judith appeared at Ethan's elbow. "We should go," she said. "The reporters outside are going to want to talk to someone, and I'd prefer that someone to be me rather than you for the moment." "Fine by me," Ethan said. The reporters were there, 4 of them, including Diane Yee from the Harbor Chronicle, who gave Ethan a brief nod that acknowledged the story and his role in it without making more of either than the moment required. Judith handled the questions with the exact measured precision of someone who had been doing this for years, confirming the postponement, declining to characterize the documentation discrepancy, staying firmly in the lane of the flood safety issue and the shelter residents' housing situation. Ethan stood slightly to the side and did not speak to the cameras. He answered 2 questions from Diane quietly, off to one side, after the others had dispersed, factual questions about the engineering assessment that she phrased correctly and that he answered in language he was comfortable seeing in print. "One more thing," Diane said, her recorder still running. "You've been identified in the filing as Ethan Calloway Mercer. You've kept that name out of public record for 6 years. Why now?" He thought about how to answer that. There were several true answers. He chose the simplest one. "Because the evidence needed someone to stand behind it who had standing," he said. "And I was the right person. I'd been the right person for a while. I just needed a reason to stop pretending otherwise." She wrote something. He wasn't sure what she'd do with that, but it was true, which was the only standard he was currently applying. Hotep. The independent review team arrived Monday morning. 3 municipal engineers and a city inspector, carrying equipment cases and clipboards, and the particular focused efficiency of professionals who have been called in on something that someone would prefer had not become a situation. Ray gave them full access, and Gerald walked them down to the basement because Gerald had by that point become the building's unofficial historian of the lower levels, a role he had grown into with quiet satisfaction. Ethan was not permitted to be part of the review. It was independent, which meant independent from him as well, but Marcus Webb was there in an advisory capacity, which was close enough. Marcus called him at noon from outside the building. "They found it," Marcus said. "The gate, the counter, the bypass mechanism, the tool marks on the reset housing. One of the municipal engineers, older guy named Peterson, apparently recognized your mother's counter design immediately. Said he'd seen the same installation in 2 other chambers on the western waterfront. She used it everywhere," Ethan said. He was sitting in the shelter's common room, pretending to read a magazine. Standard redundancy protocol for her major flood installations. She didn't trust digital-only logging. Peterson said, Marcus paused, and Ethan could hear him choosing words. Peterson said it was the cleanest evidence of deliberate system manipulation he'd seen in 23 years of infrastructure review. I wasn't casual about it. He stopped and made everyone in the room be quiet while he looked at it. Another pause. "I think that's significant." "It is," Ethan said. "The formal review report will take 10 to 14 days. The gala had been planned for months before any of this began. Clara's Foundation held its annual winter fundraiser every November at the Harbor Grand Hotel, a ballroom event that raised money for urban housing initiatives and served as the foundation's most visible public moment of the year. It had been on the calendar since January. Tickets were $1,500. Corporate tables were $15,000. Clara had never canceled it in the 12 years the foundation had run it. Not for weather, not for personal circumstances, not for anything. She did not cancel it now. Ethan heard about the gala from Diane Yi, who called him on Tuesday to ask if he planned to attend. He said no. She said the independent review team had apparently indicated, not formally, but in the way that things sometimes get indicated, that their preliminary findings would be available by the weekend. He said he understood. She said she'd be covering the gala. He said he understood that too. What he didn't know, until Judith called him Wednesday evening, was that someone on the city inspector's team had informed the planning board chair that the preliminary findings were significant enough to present before the vote, which had been rescheduled for the following Tuesday, and that Odom had decided the most appropriate venue for a transparent preliminary presentation was the gala, where reporters, investors, city officials, and foundation stakeholders would all be present. "He's going to present at the gala?" Ethan said. "Not present exactly," Judith said. "He's requested the opportunity to run the independent diagnostic in front of witnesses at the event. The digital system will display its readings in the hotel's main ballroom. The foundation was planning a live infrastructure display as part of their showcase, apparently. A new monitoring dashboard they'd been building. Odom is going to use that infrastructure to run the real diagnostic." Ethan sat down on his bed. "Clara agreed to this?" he said. Apparently she agreed to it before she knew what Peterson's team had found. By the time she did know, declining would have looked like obstruction. Judith paused. Her lawyers tried to negotiate the format, but Odom held firm. He wants the city's independent engineer to run the diagnostic live, in front of witnesses, with no advance knowledge of the results shared with either party. Both the digital display and the mechanical indicator, Ethan said. "Yes. Peterson has arranged for a camera to be placed in the lower chamber, connected to a live feed that will display the mechanical counter and gate indicator on a screen in the ballroom. Whatever both systems show, everyone sees it simultaneously." He was quiet for a long moment. "When you said everyone," he said. "I meant everyone," Judith said. "Investors, board members, reporters, the foundation's major donors, city officials, and shelter residents. Odom specifically requested that a group of current shelter residents be included as community stakeholders." Ethan thought about Felicity and her good coat. He thought about Gerald and Dev and Bertrand. He thought about Ray, who had kept pieces for 22 years against the possibility that something would come together. "I need to be there," he said. "I know. I've already added you to the community stakeholder list." A pause. "Wear something better than what you wore to the board meeting." "I don't have anything better than that." A brief silence. "I know someone who does alterations. Give me the sizes." The Harbor Grand Hotel had a ballroom that occupied the entire second floor, with a glass floor section along the east side that looked down into a decorative atrium designed to resemble an urban waterway, a tribute to the city's harbor history, installed when the hotel was renovated 8 years ago. It was beautiful in the calculated way of things that have been designed to be beautiful, and it worked. The room filled with the kind of light that made people look important and feel generous. By 7 o'clock, 340 people were in it. Ethan stood near the east side of the room, close enough to the glass floor section to see the atrium below, wearing a suit jacket that Judith's contact had altered competently, if not perfectly. The left shoulder was slightly off, which bothered him in the way small imperfections bother people who are trying to maintain composure through the mechanism of their appearance. He wore it anyway. He had long since decided that perfect was not the standard he was working toward. Felicity was nearby, in her good coat over a blue dress she'd borrowed from a woman named Agnes on the second floor. She had her hands folded in front of her, and she was looking around the ballroom with the calm, observant expression of someone cataloging everything without being intimidated by any of it. Gerald was next to her, in a sports coat that fit him well, and which he'd told Ethan he'd bought at a thrift store for $4 years ago and kept for occasions. Dev was there. Bertrand was there, straight-backed and quiet, wearing the kind of suit that a man who used to manage municipal contracts would have in the back of a closet. Ray was not there. He was at the shelter, because someone had to be, and Ray had said simply that he didn't need to be at the ballroom to know how this ended. He'd said it without drama, just the flat confidence of a man who had made his assessment and stood behind it. The foundation's infrastructure display was along the north wall. 3 large screens showing a live dashboard of the flood monitoring system for the Eastern Waterfront District. Green indicators across the board. Clean lines. Everything normal, according to the digital readings that Ethan knew had been carefully managed for over a year. Peterson's team had installed the camera in the sub-basement that afternoon. The feed was connected to a 4th screen, smaller, positioned at the edge of the display array. It showed the mechanical chamber in dim light, the gate assembly, the pipes, and at the left edge of the frame, the housing of Catherine Mercer Calloway's counter with its cracked glass face. Clara was on the opposite side of the room. He saw her when he came in, and she saw him, a brief, direct eye contact that lasted about 2 seconds and contained a complicated conversation that neither of them was going to have tonight. She looked tired in the way that people look tired when they have been managing a very large and complicated situation by will alone, and the will is starting to run low. She also looked composed, which was something she had always been good at. He gave her credit for that, because it was true. At 7:30, Walter Odom moved to the front of the room. The crowd settled with the rustling efficiency of an event crowd that has been signaled that something official is happening. Odom introduced himself briefly and explained the independent review in neutral procedural language. The city had received a safety filing, had conducted a preliminary review, and was going to present the diagnostic findings this evening in front of assembled stakeholders because transparency in public infrastructure matters was a city obligation. He did not editorialize. He did not characterize the situation. He said what it was and let it stand. Then he introduced Peterson. Peterson was in his late 50s, stocky, with the deliberate physical economy of someone who had spent decades in basements and utility rooms and had calibrated his presence to the spaces where the real work happened rather than the spaces where it got discussed. He stood at the front of the room in a city inspector's jacket that was out of place in the ballroom and clearly did not care. He had a tablet. He had a technician standing by the display screens. "We're going to run a gate cycle diagnostic on the Eastern Waterfront Primary Flood Control System," he said. "The digital monitoring dashboard will display the system's self-reported status in real time. Simultaneously, the camera feed on the smaller screen will show the mechanical indicator in the sub-basement chamber beneath the building at 414 Clement Street. These 2 systems should agree. The mechanical indicator should move when the gate cycles. Let's see what happens." The room was very quiet. Peterson nodded to his technician. The technician entered a command on the control console connected to the digital monitoring system. On the large dashboard screens, the gate status indicator began its cycle sequence. The digital readout showed the gate moving from bypass to operational position, green lights shifting, percentage indicators climbing, the clean visual language of a system reporting exactly what it was supposed to report. On the small screen, in the dim light of the sub-basement, the mechanical indicator did not move. The gate assembly sat exactly where it had been sitting. The counter held its number. The indicator arrow, which should have swung to reflect a gate in motion, was perfectly, completely still. The room had been quiet before. Now it was a different kind of quiet. The particular silence of 340 people simultaneously understanding something they had not understood 30 seconds ago. Ethan heard someone near him, a man in a tuxedo he didn't recognize, say, very quietly, "Oh." Peterson looked at the screens, both of them. Then he turned to the room. "The digital system reports the gate has completed a full operational cycle," he said. "The mechanical indicator shows no movement. The gate has not moved." He said it without drama, the way you state something that states itself. The digital reporting system and the physical reality of the gate are not in agreement. The room's silence cracked. Not into chaos, into the low, urgent sound of 300 people beginning to process something in real time. Reporters in the back were already on their phones. The city officials near the center of the room had that particular closed, careful expression of people who are rapidly calculating what this means for them specifically. Ethan looked across the room at Clara. She was looking at the screens. Not at him, not at Peterson, not at the room. At the screens. At the small screen where the mechanical indicator had not moved. Her face was doing something complicated and private that he was not going to try to read from across a ballroom. Then one of her legal team leaned close and said something to her, and she straightened, and Ethan saw the decision happen. He saw it in real time, the moment when she resolved into a course of action. She moved toward the control console with the purposeful walk of a woman who has spent her life walking into rooms where people were not expecting her to walk in. "I have executive authorization for this system under the Foundation City Partnership Agreement," she said to the technician. "I'd like to run a manual reset." Peterson looked at her. "You're welcome to," he said. "The system will log the authorization." She took the tablet the technician offered. She entered her credentials. She ran the executive reset, a clean, authoritative action, exactly the kind of thing that had probably resolved problems for her many times before in many different rooms. On the dashboard screens, the system logged the action. Executive reset authorized. Callaway C. Whitmore. Timestamp 4723. And then, below that, in the same log, in the same automatic timestamp format that the system applied to every action it recorded. Manual gate override engaged. Callaway. C. Whitmore. Timestamp 194723. The executive reset and the manual override had been logged simultaneously because they were the same action. Because the executive reset function and the manual override function had been bound together in the system at some point in the past 14 months, and the system did not distinguish between them and had been dutifully logging every reset as an override under the authorization credentials of whoever ran it. Every single one of those 412 overrides that the mechanical counter had recorded. Every access event logged under the Foundation's partnership authorization. Every visit time to the aftermath of a rainfall. All of it, sitting in the system log, under the same credential. The dashboard displayed the log entry for 4 full seconds before anyone in the room said anything. 4 seconds is a long time when 300 people are reading the same screen simultaneously. Then the room was not quiet at all. Ethan stood near the glass floor section and looked at the atrium below and felt something move through him that was not satisfaction and not triumph and not vindication. Those were too clean for what this actually was. What he felt was closer to grief, which surprised him until it didn't. Because the woman standing at that control console had once been the person he chose, and whatever she had done and whatever it meant, that was still true, and it cost something to stand in a ballroom and watch it come apart. Felicity appeared at his elbow. She didn't say anything, she just stood next to him, solid and present, which was exactly what was needed. He heard Peterson, in a clear and measured voice, ask the room for order. He heard the Foundation's lawyers begin moving and talking in the rapid, managed way of people executing a crisis protocol they had prepared for and hoped they would never use. He heard a reporter near the back asking Diane Yee something, and Diane Yee's response, which was quick and certain, because she had been waiting for this moment and knew exactly what to do with it. He didn't move for a while. He stood at the edge of the glass floor and let the room do what it was doing, because there was nothing left for him to manage. The machine had spoken. The mechanical counter in the sub-basement, the one his mother had installed with her particular insistence on truth-telling that could not be argued with or edited after the fact, had been exactly right all along. It had needed only a room full of witnesses to make it matter. Peterson's voice carried over the noise again, asking for attention. Ethan turned from the atrium and looked at the small screen on the display wall, the camera feed from the sub-basement. The chamber was still and dim and unchanged. The gate assembly sat in bypass. The counter held its number. The mechanical indicator was exactly where it had been at the start of the evening, which was exactly where it had been for 14 months, unmoved and unarguable and patiently correct. Clara had moved away from the console. Her legal team was around her, close and protective, running what they were trained to run. She was not looking at the screens anymore. She was looking at the floor with an expression that Ethan recognized. Not because he'd seen it on her before, but because he'd seen it on himself. It was the expression of a person who has come to the end of a version of events and has not yet begun to understand what comes next. He did not cross the room to her. That wasn't his job tonight. His job had been to stand in front of a machine and ask it to tell the truth. He'd done that. Whatever happened next would happen in courtrooms and boardrooms, and the columns of newspapers and the long, unglamorous process of institutional accountability that rarely looks like justice, and usually is anyway, if you're patient enough. Judith found him 20 minutes later, when the room had reorganized itself around the event, clusters of conversation, the controlled urgency of reporters on deadline, city officials in closed consultation along one wall. The Foundation's table largely empty now. The board chair has requested the digital log be preserved immediately as evidence, she said. The city attorney's office is going to want to speak with you next week. Fine. The attorney general's office may also… Fine, he said again. Whatever they need. She looked at him for a moment with the evaluating attention she brought to everything. How are you? He thought about it honestly, which was what the question deserved. I'm tired, he said. And I'm sad in ways I didn't expect to be sad. And I think the shelter is probably going to be okay. He paused. That last part is the part that matters most to me tonight. Judith nodded slowly. The demolition is off the table indefinitely. The city can't proceed with a contested sale while there's an active infrastructure investigation. She paused. Ray's going to have some breathing room to figure out the long-term situation. Good. He looked around the ballroom, at the magnificent calculated room with its waterway atrium and its expensive light, at the shelter residents scattered through it in their borrowed and thrifted good clothes, at Felicity still standing near the glass floor with her hands folded and her chin at its particular angle. Tell Ray it worked, he said. I'll call him, but tell him first. He waited a long time. Judith took out her phone and stepped away to make the call, and Ethan stood alone for a moment in the middle of the ballroom and breathed and let himself be tired, which was the honest and appropriate thing to be. Dev appeared next to him, wearing an expression that was trying to be calm and not quite managing it. So that was the system logging itself, Dev said. Every time someone ran the reset, it logged as an override under their name. Yes. It was doing that the whole time. Every access visit, every reset. It kept the record. It kept the record, Ethan agreed. Dev shook his head slowly. The old system kept the record, he said. Not the new one. That's right. Because the old one couldn't be edited. That's right. Dev was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Your mother built it that way on purpose. Yes, Ethan said. She did. Dev nodded, once, with the particular gravity of someone who has just understood something that will take a while to fully settle. Then he said, Gerald wants to know if we're getting dinner on the way back. Ethan almost laughed. He didn't quite manage it, but something in his face moved in that direction, and it felt like the most human thing he'd felt in a room full of expensive suits in a very long time. Tell Gerald yes, he said, wherever he wants. They went to a diner 4 blocks from the shelter, because Gerald said the diner had good pie, and staying out a little longer felt necessary. Not celebratory exactly. More like the way you need to walk around after something large has happened before you can sit still again. It was past 9 o'clock and the diner was mostly empty, a few booths occupied by people with nowhere particular to be on a Friday night, and the counterwoman brought coffee without being asked, and pie when they ordered it and left them alone in the particular decent way of diner staff who understand that sometimes people need a table and not an experience. Felicity ate her pie with the focused appreciation of someone who had been looking forward to pie for a while. Dev held his coffee cup in both hands and stared at the table occasionally with the expression of someone replaying something in his head. Bertrand ate and didn't speak much, but he had a quality of settledness to him that had not been there 2 weeks ago. The quality of a man who had been carrying something and had finally set it down. Gerald talked. Gerald was a talker when he was relieved, which Ethan had learned in 2 weeks of living beside him. And tonight he talked about the building and the basement and the counter and the moment in the ballroom when the mechanical indicator had not moved, and he talked about it with the enthusiasm of someone who had been present at something and was still figuring out the full shape of it. The whole time, Gerald said, the whole time it was just sitting there counting. Didn't matter what anybody told the computer. Didn't matter what the log said. The old counter just kept going. That was the point of it, Ethan said. Your mother knew someone would mess with the new system eventually. She knew systems get messed with. She didn't know who or when. She just built around the possibility. Gerald shook his head slowly and took another bite of pie. Smart woman. She was, Ethan said, and it came out simpler and truer than a lot of things he'd said in the past 2 weeks. They stayed until nearly 11. When they walked back to the shelter, the November air had gone sharper, and the street was quiet enough that their footsteps were audible, and Ethan walked in the middle of the group and felt, not happy, not exactly, but present. Fully present in a way he hadn't been in a long time, which was its own kind of thing. He had been half absent for years. Present in rooms, present at dinners, present at events. but always with a portion of himself held back, wrapped around the question of who he was supposed to be in relation to Clara's world. That portion of himself was no longer on loan to that question. It was just his again, which was disorienting and uncomfortable, and also, underneath the discomfort, something close to relief. Ray was awake when they got back, sitting in his office with the door open and a cup of tea going cold on the desk. He looked up when Ethan appeared in the doorway. "Judith called," Ray said. "I know." "She said it worked." "It worked," Ethan said. Ray nodded once, with the economy of a man who has learned that large feelings don't require large expressions. Then he said, "Sit down." Ethan sat. Ray picked up his cold tea, looked at it, and set it back down. 22 years, he said. "I've run this place for 22 years. You know how many times someone told me it was going to close?" "How many?" 11. 11 different threats, funding cuts, zoning changes, health violations that weren't actually violations, a landlord dispute in 2011 that went to court, 2 different demolition proposals before this one. He looked at the desk. Every time something came together. Not always what I expected, not always how I expected, but something came together. He paused. This time I was not confident something would come together. I want you to know that. I was not optimistic when you walked in here 3 weeks ago with your boxes and your coffee stain. I was not particularly optimistic either, Ethan said. No, but you went down to the basement anyway. I was an engineer in a building I didn't know. It's what I do. Ray looked at him steadily. It's not just what you do. It's what you chose to do when you could have sat upstairs and felt sorry for yourself. He paused. I'm not giving you a speech. I just want to say thank you. Directly. Without making it into something. Ethan looked at the desk and at Ray's hands and at the 22 years of files stacked around them. I needed a place to be, he said. You gave me one. That's not nothing either. They sat for a moment in this particular comfortable silence of 2 people who understand each other without needing to explain themselves further. Then Ray said, What are you going to do now? It was the question Ethan had been not asking himself for 3 weeks. He'd been moving too fast for it, one piece after another, no time to look at the landscape. Now the movement had slowed and the question was right there, patient and unavoidable. I don't know yet, he said, which was true. My license lapsed. I need to renew it. That's the first practical thing. He paused. And the Mercer Callaway Trust has infrastructure obligations I've been ignoring for 6 years. The Eastern Waterfront Network is mine to oversee, legally. I've been letting the city handle it without any engagement from the trust side. He looked at the wall. That ends. Is that enough? Ray said. As work? It's a start. He thought about it. The trust has resources, not unlimited, but real. My mother built it to fund infrastructure safety work, not to sit in an account. He glanced at Ray. I've been thinking about a resident council for this building, for the decisions that affect the people living here. Ray raised an eyebrow. Not instead of your management, Ethan said. Alongside it. Residents who have a formal voice in what happens with the building, the maintenance, the decisions about the parcel. If the city is going to do a long-term review of this property, the people living here should have standing in that process. He paused. I can help structure that. Make it something with legal weight. Ray was quiet for a long moment. Felicity would run it, he said. Yes, Ethan said. She would. Gerald would try to run it, and Felicity would let him think he was. Also, yes. A small smile crossed Ray's face, genuine and brief, the kind that doesn't linger because it doesn't need to. All right, he said. Let's talk about it properly when the dust settles. He picked up his cold tea again, drank it anyway, and set it down with the expression of a man making his peace with things being slightly wrong and doing fine regardless. Get some sleep. You look terrible. I've looked terrible for 3 weeks, Ethan said. You've looked terrible in different ways. Tonight is a different way. Ray waved a hand toward the door. Go. The city attorney's office called on Monday. The attorney general's office called on Wednesday. The planning board's administrative team called on Thursday to confirm that the demolition order had been formally suspended pending a comprehensive infrastructure review that would take a minimum of 6 months and possibly longer. By the end of the week, the Whitmore Foundation had issued a statement announcing that Clara had voluntarily stepped back from her executive role pending the outcome of the city investigation, and that the foundation's board had appointed an interim director. Ethan read the statement on his phone, sitting on the bench in the park where he'd taken Clara's call 2 weeks earlier. The pigeon was back, or possibly a different pigeon, it was difficult to tell, working the pavement with the same focused persistence. The old man with the newspaper was not there. Different morning, different bench configuration of the world. He read the statement twice. It was carefully written, acknowledging the investigation, affirming the foundation's commitment to transparency, saying nothing specific about what had happened or who had made which decisions. It was the kind of statement that lawyers write when the truth is complicated and the institution needs to survive the person. Clara's name appeared twice, once to announce her stepping back, once in a line that called her a founding leader whose commitment to the city's communities had defined the foundation's work. Neither sentence was false. Both sentences were incomplete. That was the nature of institutional statements, and it was probably unavoidable, and it still bothered him in the specific way that careful incompleteness always bothers people who have spent time trying to be precise. He put the phone in his pocket and looked at the trees. He had not spoken to Clara since the night of the gala, not from anger, not from strategy, but because there was nothing yet to say that was ready to be said. The divorce proceedings were moving through Judith and the Foundation's counsel in the methodical, impersonal way of legal processes that have been set in motion and will complete themselves regardless of how the people involved feel about it. The joint accounts were being properly separated. The questions of shared assets were being addressed by people whose job it was to address them. Ethan had given Judith a clear and limited instruction: be fair, don't be punitive, and finish it. Judith had said she would. He did not want money from Clara. He had more money than he had been letting himself remember. The Mercer-Callaway Trust, which he had ignored for 6 years, was substantial. His mother had not been casual about the financial architecture of what she left behind, any more than she had been casual about the engineering architecture of what she built. The trust held real estate, investment accounts, and an archive of infrastructure licensing agreements that generated revenue on a schedule. Ethan had not looked at in 6 years and discovered, when he finally did look, was considerably larger than he'd vaguely recalled. He was not going to be a man without resources. He had simply, briefly, been a man who forgot he had them, or chose to forget, which was not the same thing but was related. The engineering license renewal was approved at the end of the second week, after he passed the reinstatement review that lapsed licenses required. He sat in a small office in the State Licensing Board building and answered questions from a reviewer who seemed slightly uncertain why a Mercer-Callaway was sitting across from her for a routine reinstatement review. And Ethan answered the questions plainly and without making more of the name than the questions required. When he left the licensing office, he stood on the sidewalk for a moment and felt the weight of a small, specific thing. He was an engineer again, in the official sense, in the sense that would allow him to stamp a document and stand behind it and be accountable for what it said. He had not realized, until he had it back, how much the lapse had cost him. Not in practical terms. He'd still done the work, still thought like an engineer, still read buildings and flood systems and load distributions the way other people read text. But in some quieter sense, the unlicensed years had been years of speaking without standing, of knowing without being permitted to say. He was permitted now. Peterson's formal review report was released 5 weeks after the gala. Ethan read it the morning it was published, all 68 pages, which took him the better part of 3 hours at the table in the shelter's common room with a cup of coffee and the particular focused attention that he brought to documents that mattered. The report was thorough and unambiguous. The floodgate at 4 and 14 Clement Street had been maintained in manual bypass for a period of not less than 14 months. The digital monitoring system had been altered to report normal operational status, regardless of the gate's actual position, through a modification to the reporting software that had been implemented under the Foundation's system administrator credentials. The mechanical counter installed by Catherine Mercer-Callaway in 1991 had recorded 479 manual override events, 67 more than the counter had shown the night Ethan first found it, because the bypass had been maintained through the period of the review. The modification to the digital system was not consistent with an administrative error or a technical malfunction. It was consistent with deliberate alteration. The report recommended immediate remediation of the gate system, a comprehensive audit of all digital records related to the eastern waterfront flood infrastructure, and referral of the documentation discrepancy findings to the appropriate law enforcement authorities. The last section of the report contained a paragraph that Ethan read 3 times. It said, "The mechanical redundancy system designed by C.M. Callaway and installed in this chamber represents engineering best practice that has not been widely implemented in the city's subsequent infrastructure upgrades. The review team recommends a comprehensive assessment of the eastern waterfront flood network to identify other chambers lacking equivalent mechanical redundancy, with the goal of implementing comparable systems where feasible." The integrity of the infrastructure that serves this city depends not only on digital monitoring, which is efficient and scalable, but on verification systems that remain functional independent of digital access or modification. Ethan read that paragraph a 4th time. Then he closed the report and sat for a while with his hands around his coffee cup, thinking about his mother. She had been a precise woman, not cold, precise, which is different. She had believed that caring about something meant understanding it exactly, not approximately. She had believed that the most important things needed to be built so that they could speak for themselves when the people responsible for speaking were absent or unwilling. She had died at 51 from an illness that moved fast and did not care about precision or fairness or what still needed to be done. And he had been 27 and newly married and had handled the grief by putting it in a box and building a life around the box instead of through it. 6 years later, the box had opened anyway, because boxes like that always do. They open when you end up in a basement with a flashlight and find a counter that your dead mother installed and understand, in the specific language of a specific kind of work, exactly what she was thinking when she put it there. She was thinking, the truth needs a place to live that no one can take away from it. He thought that was the thing. The lesson, if you wanted to call it that, though lessons implied they were learned once and retained cleanly, which was not how it worked. It was more like a recognition that came and went and came back. The truth needs a place to live. You build it that place, and then you accept responsibility for the building, not just once, but continuously, for as long as you are the person able to do it. He had spent 6 years not accepting that responsibility. Not out of cowardice, or not only out of cowardice, but out of a genuine uncertainty about what the responsibility meant, and a marriage that had given him reasons to keep the uncertainty unresolved. He had been useful to Clara in ways that had not required him to be fully himself, and he had accepted that usefulness as a substitute for something more complete, and it had worked until it didn't. Now it didn't, and here he was. The remediation of the floodgate took 3 weeks. Ethan was present for all of it, not as a supervisor, because the city's team handled the work, but as the Mercer Callaway Trust representative, which gave him standing to observe and to review the documentation at each stage. Peterson ran the project and ran it well, with the unhurried precision of someone who had spent decades doing exactly this kind of work and was not going to be rushed by calendars or optics. On the day the gate was restored to full operational status, and the system ran its first clean diagnostic, mechanical indicator and digital dashboard in agreement for the first time in over a year, Ethan was standing in the sub-basement with Peterson and Gerald, who had become a permanent, unofficial presence in any basement-related event. The diagnostic ran. The gate cycled. The mechanical indicator moved, a clean, definitive swing from the bypass position to the operational position and back, exactly as it had been designed to do in 1991, exactly as it would have done any time in the past 14 months if the bypass had not been holding it. Gerald made a sound that was not quite a word. Peterson looked at the indicator for a moment with the expression of an experienced man seeing something function correctly after it has been deliberately broken, which contains a specific kind of satisfaction that is different from the satisfaction of seeing something work that was merely neglected. "Good," Peterson said, "just that." Then he wrote something on his clipboard. Ethan looked at the counter. The number had not changed since Peterson's team had frozen it as evidence. 479. It would stay at that number as a record. Peterson had recommended it, and the city had agreed, and Ethan had formally requested it on behalf of the trust. Not as a monument, just as a fact that deserved to remain visible. "Your mother would have been satisfied with this," Peterson said, without looking up from his clipboard. "She would have said it shouldn't have been necessary," Ethan said. "That too," Peterson agreed. "Both things." The resident council was formally established 6 weeks after the gala, with Judith providing the legal framework and Ethan funding the organizational costs through the trust. Felicity was elected chair by a margin that surprised no one who had spent more than a week in the building. Gerald became the facilities liaison, which meant he did most of the same things he'd been doing informally for 4 months, but now had a title and a clipboard, which seemed to please him. Dev joined the council's housing advocacy subcommittee and, in the same week, received his housing voucher approval. News he announced at dinner one Thursday, with the careful restraint of a man who has learned not to celebrate things until they are real and tangible and in his hand, and then allowed himself briefly to be genuinely happy. Bertrand did not stay at the shelter. He found a room in a shared apartment on the north side, with 2 other men roughly his age, and he left on a Tuesday morning with his bags and a handshake for Ray, and a longer handshake for Ethan, and a look between them that covered everything that had been said in the shelter dining room and everything that had been done afterward and did not need to be re-summarized. "You did a good thing," Bertrand said. "You did a good thing too," Ethan said. "Before me. You kept the information. You held on to it when there was nowhere for it to go." Bertrand shrugged, with the self-deprecating awkwardness of a man who is not comfortable being thanked. "Seemed like the right thing to hold on to." "It was," Ethan said. "Well, he moved out of the shelter on a Thursday in December, 41 days after Soren had driven him there in Clara's car with his 2 boxes and his duffel bag. He left because it was the right thing to do, because the shelter had 64 people who needed beds and he was not one of them anymore, and because the Mercer Callaway Trust had an apartment in the city that had been sitting empty for 2 years while he lived in the Harborview Tower. The apartment was on the 7th floor of a building in the Dockside neighborhood, with windows that looked east over the waterfront. It was not large. It was not particularly decorated. His mother had used it as a working base when she was in the city for infrastructure projects. And it had her particular aesthetic, which was functional and clean and not interested in impressing anyone. There was a desk, there were bookshelves, there was a kitchen that had the right equipment and nothing excessive. He set his boxes down in the living room and put his mother's photograph on the bookshelf and stood in the quiet of a space that was his, actually his, not borrowed, not tolerated, not maintained by someone else's money and someone else's name, and let the quiet be quiet. It was not triumphant. That was the thing about real endings, as opposed to the endings in stories where the wronged party gets the penthouse and the apology and the clarity. Real endings are quieter and stranger and full of loose threads that don't resolve into neat meaning. He had 41 days of his life that he would not have chosen. He had a flood system that was working again. He had a shelter full of people who were still there. He had a name he had stopped hiding and a license he had stopped neglecting and a set of obligations he was going to start meeting. He did not have his marriage, which had been failing for longer than he'd admitted, and had ended in a lobby with a paper cup of coffee on the marble floor. He did not have his mother, which was an older loss and a permanent one. He had what he had built and what he had accepted, and what he had refused to walk away from when walking away would have been easier. That was enough to work with. It had always been enough to work with. He had simply, for a long time, chosen not to. The investigation into the digital system alteration and the documentation discrepancy was handled by the city's Inspector General's office over the following months. Ethan cooperated fully and provided everything requested and did not, at any point, speak to the press about the specific findings, because it was not his investigation and he had said what he had to say, and the rest of it belonged to people with subpoena authority and no personal stake in the outcome. Clara's deputy director, a man named Warren Fitch, who had been at the foundation for 9 years, was ultimately identified as the individual who had modified the digital monitoring software and managed the ongoing bypass maintenance. He had acted, the investigation found, in anticipation of the development deal's financial benefit to the foundation's operating budget, an expected contribution from the development LLC that had been informally agreed upon before the demolition application was ever filed. He had made the decisions about the digital system himself, without, the investigation concluded, Clara's direct knowledge of the specific technical alterations. Clara had known the bypass was established during the donor tour. She had been told, and had believed, that it was restored. She had known the submitted engineering report was shorter than the original. She had been told, and had chosen to believe, that the omission was legally appropriate. She had not asked questions she probably should have asked. She had not looked at things she probably should have looked at. That was not innocence. It was also not the same as what Warren Fitch had done. The investigation drew the distinction, and the law drew its own distinctions, and Ethan was not in a position to say the distinctions were wrong because he had spent 11 years watching Clara, and he knew her, actually knew her, which was different from admiring or resenting her. And the woman he knew was capable of a great many things and not capable of some others. She was placed on permanent leave from the foundation. The development deal was cancelled. The LLC was dissolved. Dominic Farron resigned from the case and was separately investigated for his role in structuring the purchase, a process that Ethan watched from a distance with the dispassionate attention he had learned to bring to things he could not control and did not want to be consumed by. Their divorce was finalized on a Friday in February in a courthouse on the west side of the city in a proceeding that lasted 40 minutes and involved no particular drama. Judith was there. The foundation's counsel was there. Clara was there, in a gray coat he hadn't seen before, looking like herself in a way that was neither hostile nor warm, but simply true. The way people look when they have stopped managing their presentation and are just present in the room. They did not speak directly during the proceeding. Afterward, in the courthouse corridor, she stopped and turned and said his name. He stopped. She looked at him for a moment with the complicated attention of someone who has a great deal to say and has decided, after considerable thought, to say very little of it. "I hope you do well," she said, "with the trust, with the infrastructure work." She paused. "I think you're good at it." "I know I am," he said, not arrogantly, just plainly. It was one of the few things he'd always known. Something moved across her face that he couldn't fully read. "Yes," she said. "I know you know." She walked away down the corridor and he watched her go. And he felt all the things you feel at the end of 11 years with a person, the specific texture of shared time, the things that had been real, the ways they had failed each other, the fact that he had loved her, and the fact that love is not the same as compatible, and the fact that the ending had been the right ending, even if the manner of it had been cruel. He felt all of it in roughly 4 seconds, which is how these things work. The whole weight of a chapter compressed into the moment of its closing, and then you walk forward and it is a different chapter. He walked forward. There is something people say about powerful men in their falls, that the higher they are, the harder the landing. But Ethan Calloway Mercer had not fallen from a height. He had been deposited at the bottom by someone who thought the bottom would break him, and it hadn't. And the reason it hadn't was not because he was exceptional or because things worked out the way they should. Things do not always work out the way they should. He knew that. The reason was simpler and less satisfying as a story. He had gone down to the basement. He had looked at what was there. He had not looked away from it or minimized it or waited for someone else to take responsibility for it. He had done the work that the evidence required, with the tools he had in the time available, and the truth had turned out to be something that a mechanical counter could hold for 14 months without anyone's permission and without anyone being able to argue it into a different shape. His mother had known that. She had built her whole engineering philosophy around it. Real things, the actual position of a gate, the actual number of times someone had pushed the override lever, the actual load on an actual foundation, don't require anyone to believe in them to remain true. They just remain true. And the job of a good engineer is to build systems that let those real things speak when the people responsible for speaking have decided silence suits them better. He had been silent for 6 years. About his name, about his obligations, about the gap between what he knew and what he was doing with what he knew. He did not think of that silence as a sin or a failure in any dramatic sense. He thought of it as a choice that had cost him things, and that he was now choosing differently, and that the different choice was harder in some ways and lighter in others, and was his to make. In March, the city approved a new maintenance agreement for the Eastern Waterfront Flood Infrastructure, with the Mercer Calloway Trust named as an independent oversight body. Ethan attended the signing with Peterson, who shook his hand with the dry practicality of someone completing a transaction that should have been in place for years, and then returned immediately to the work of overseeing 3 other infrastructure projects, because there was always more work. Ethan went to the shelter that afternoon. Not because he lived there, he didn't anymore, but because the resident council had its monthly meeting at 4 o'clock, and he had been asked to attend as a guest, which meant Felicity had told him to be there at 4, and he understood that when Felicity told you to be somewhere, you were there. The meeting was held in the common room, 12 people around the long table where Ethan had eaten dinner on his first night and every night for 41 days. Felicity ran it with the organized patience of someone who has spent decades managing the dynamics of groups of people who feel strongly about things. Gerald had 3 agenda items he wanted to add, and 2 of them were reasonable. A woman named Harriet raised a concern about the 3rd-floor bathroom that was legitimate and had been ignored for 4 months. A newer resident named Thomas, who had been at the shelter for 2 weeks, sat at the end of the table and didn't say much, but listened with the alert attention of someone who is still figuring out how to be in this particular place. Ethan recognized that look. He had worn it himself. After the meeting, Felicity walked with him to the front door. It was a gray afternoon, the kind of gray that might become rain later, or might just remain gray, not making any particular decision. "You're going to come back," she said. It was not a question. "To the meetings?" "Yes." "To check on things." She looked at him with the direct, unadorned attention that was her particular gift. "You're the kind of person who comes back. I've met the other kind, and you're not it." He stood in the doorway and looked at the street, the Vietnamese grocery, the space where the closed laundromat had been, which was now a pop-up plant shop that had appeared 3 weeks earlier and seemed to be doing reasonable business. Normal city life, continuing in all directions. "I'll come back," he said. "Good." She patted his arm once, with the brisk warmth of a woman who expresses affection through action rather than performance. "Now go do the work. You've got a whole network of basements to worry about." He went. The street was cold and real and uninterested in his story, which was appropriate. Stories that matter are not the ones where the world stops to acknowledge you. They are the ones where you do the thing in front of you, and then the next thing, and then the next, without waiting for the world to confirm that you were right to do it. The confirmation comes later, or it doesn't, and either way the thing still needed to be done. His mother had known that too. She had built her redundancies without ever knowing if they would be needed, without knowing who would find them, or when, or under what circumstances. She had built them because the work required it, and because she understood that what you choose to do with what you have is the whole of the question, the beginning and the end of it. He understood that now. He had understood it before. In theory, the way you understand things that have not yet cost you anything. But he understood it differently now, in the specific and irreversible way that things become real when they have passed through you. He walked toward the waterfront, because the trust office was in that direction, and there were 3 infrastructure reviews pending and a meeting with Peterson at 5, and the work was there, waiting for him, the way real work always waits, patiently, without judgment, simply present and necessary, and his to do. Behind him, on Clement Street, the shelter held its 64 people in its patched and imperfect walls, and below them, in the sub-basement, the floodgate sat properly closed for the first time in over a year, and the mechanical counter held its number under its cracked glass face, and the city moved around all of it in its ordinary and complicated way, not knowing and not needing to know about the quiet system underneath that had simply, stubbornly, kept telling the truth until someone finally came down to listen.